The spark of change. Willow Creek was a town that wore its charm like a well-fitted jacket, hiding the frayed edges underneath. Its tree-lined streets and cozy community events gave an illusion of unity, but beneath the surface lay a brewing storm of prejudice and systemic bias, particularly within its police department. For decades, the town operated under a quiet yet pervasive culture of exclusion, one that most residents chose to ignore for the sake of peace. This was the world Officer Mark Thompson thrived in, a world that silently condoned his outdated beliefs and unchecked authority. Mark Thompson had become an institution within the Willow Creek Police Department. With his broad frame and commanding presence, he embodied the stereotype of the old-school cop. Mark saw himself as the protector of tradition, a role he believed allowed him to act with impunity. While his colleagues might have recognized his arrogance, few dared to challenge him. His disdain for minority communities wasn't overt but lived in the shadows, through routine traffic stops, veiled comments, and deliberate indifference to cases that didn't align with his narrow worldview. Linda Carrington, on the other hand, was the heart of Willow Creek. A retired schoolteacher in her early 60s, she was beloved for her compassion and quiet strength. Linda had spent her life teaching children the values of empathy, fairness, and standing up for what's right, even when it was uncomfortable. To her, change wasn't a revolution, but a slow, steady march toward justice. Her son, Jonathan, had inherited this belief, and his rise to become Willow Creek's first black chief of police was a testament to the values she instilled in him. Jonathan's appointment was met with a mixture of pride and skepticism. While many saw his leadership as a progressive step forward, others, including officers like Mark, viewed it as a threat to the status quo. Jonathan was determined to reform the department from within, but the road ahead was fraught with resistance and unspoken hostilities. It was against this backdrop that the incident unfolded, a seemingly ordinary day that would become the catalyst for an extraordinary reckoning. Linda had always found solace in the Willow Bean Café, a quaint little spot that smelled of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could sip her favorite hazelnut latte and lose herself in a good book. That morning was no different, except for the presence of Mark Thompson. Mark wasn't in uniform, but his aura of entitlement was unmistakable. He had stormed in, his face a mask of irritation, and ordered his coffee with the same clipped tone he used to bark orders. Linda noticed him immediately, but returned to her book, unwilling to let his presence disrupt her peace. Nearby, a group of college students chatted animatedly, their laughter filling the cafe. One of them, a young black man named Caleb, spoke passionately about social justice, recounting a recent protest against police brutality. Mark's ears perked up, his irritation boiling into rage. He slammed his coffee cup on the counter and marched over to their table. "You think you know what it's like to be a cop?" Mark's voice cut through the room, dripping with anger. "You have no idea what we go through every day." The cafe fell silent. Caleb tried to respond, but Mark's aggression was unyielding. His words were a tirade against what he saw as ungrateful citizens, criticizing the police force he believed he represented. Linda couldn't stay silent. She put her book down and stood, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Mark's fury. "Officer, I believe the young man is simply expressing his perspective," she said, her voice firm but measured. "Perhaps you should listen instead of shutting him down." Mark turned to her, his face twisted in indignation. "And who are you to lecture me? Do you have any idea what it's like out there?" Linda met his gaze without flinching. "I don't, but I do know that respect is a two-way street. Dismissing someone's concerns doesn't solve anything." Mark's temper snapped. In a flash of rage, he grabbed the cup of scalding coffee from his table and hurled it toward Linda. The hot liquid splashed across her face and chest, eliciting a scream that reverberated through the cafe. Chaos erupted. Patrons rushed to Linda's aid, their shouts a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. Mark, realizing the gravity of his actions, froze for a moment before bolting out the door. Linda was rushed to the hospital, her skin blistered and red from the burns. The pain was excruciating, but the emotional shock cut even deeper. She couldn't understand how a simple act of standing up for justice had led to such violence. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, Jonathan received the call that shattered his world. The victim of this horrific act wasn't just any citizen, it was his mother. His initial reaction was one of disbelief, quickly replaced by a surge of anger and determination. Jonathan arrived at the hospital to find his mother lying on a hospital bed, her face partially bandaged, but her spirit unbroken. Despite her injuries, Linda's first concern was for her son. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice steady despite the pain, "you need to use this moment to make things right. Not just for me, for everyone." Jonathan nodded, his resolve hardening. He promised his mother that justice would be served, not just against Mark, but against the system that had allowed such behavior to persist. This was no longer just a personal battle. It was a fight for the soul of Willow Creek. Meanwhile, Mark was struggling to come to terms with the fallout. He had always believed he was untouchable, shielded by the unspoken rules of a department that rarely held its own accountable. But this time was different. His victim wasn't just another faceless civilian. She was the mother of the new chief of police. Mark's colleagues distanced themselves, and his superiors launched an internal investigation. The evidence against him was damning, but Mark refused to take responsibility, convinced he was being targeted unfairly. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Mark's actions weren't an isolated incident. Complaints from minority residents began to surface, painting a picture of a man who had abused his power for years. The walls were closing in, and Mark's once secure position was now a crumbling facade. Jonathan knew that addressing this incident wasn't enough. If Willow Creek was to heal, the department needed a complete overhaul. He announced sweeping reforms, starting with mandatory bias training and the creation of a civilian oversight board. These changes were met with resistance, but Jonathan was undeterred. Linda, despite her injuries, became a symbol of resilience and courage. She began speaking publicly about her experience, using her platform to advocate for systemic change. Her quiet strength inspired others to come forward, sharing their own stories of injustice and demanding accountability. What began as a moment of violence had sparked a movement. Willow Creek was no longer content to ignore the cracks in its foundation. The town rallied behind Jonathan and Linda, determined to build a future rooted in equality and justice. But for Mark Thompson, the consequences were just beginning. His career, his reputation, and his sense of invincibility were all about to come crashing down. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of the reckoning that awaited him. The ripple effect. The shockwaves of Mark Thompson's reckless act reverberated far beyond the walls of the Willow Bean Café. In the days that followed, Willow Creek transformed from a sleepy, idyllic town into a simmering cauldron of tension and anger. What had once been a quiet but divided community now found itself at a crossroads, forced to confront truths it had long ignored. Jonathan Carrington sat in his office, staring at a stack of reports and complaints. Each piece of paper told a story: minority residents being harassed during routine traffic stops, officers using excessive force with little to no accountability, and a system that had consistently turned a blind eye to injustice. Mark Thompson's actions were just the tip of the iceberg, and Jonathan knew it. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The internal investigation into Mark had uncovered a history of troubling behavior, incidents that had been quietly dismissed or swept under the rug. It wasn't just Mark who was complicit. It was an entire culture within the department. Jonathan picked up his phone and dialed the district attorney. "We need to press charges against Officer Thompson," he said firmly. "Not just for the assault, but for every instance of misconduct we've uncovered during this investigation." The district attorney hesitated. "Jonathan, you know this is going to bring a lot of heat on you and the department. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "I don't care about the heat," Jonathan replied. "This isn't about me. It's about accountability. If we don't address this now, we're just as guilty as he is." Meanwhile, the town of Willow Creek was buzzing with activity. Linda's story had captured national attention, and reporters descended on the small town like a swarm of bees. News vans lined the streets, their antennas reaching skyward as journalists sought interviews with anyone willing to talk. Linda, still recovering from her injuries, had been reluctant to speak publicly at first, but as the days passed, she realized her voice was needed. Sitting in her modest living room, surrounded by flowers and get-well cards from supporters, she agreed to an interview with a well-known national news anchor. "I never wanted to be the center of attention," Linda said, her voice steady despite the bandages that still covered parts of her face. "But what happened to me is just one example of a much larger problem. This isn't about me. It's about a system that needs to change." The interview aired that evening, and Linda's calm yet powerful words resonated with viewers across the country. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForLinda and #ReformWillowCreek. Protests were organized in the town square, with residents holding signs that read, "Accountability for all," and "No one is above the law." Mark Thompson, however, had retreated into his home, refusing to face the growing storm. His once proud demeanor had been replaced with paranoia and bitterness. He watched the news coverage with a mixture of disbelief and anger, unable to comprehend how quickly his world had fallen apart. "This is a witch hunt," he muttered to himself, pacing his living room. "They're out to get me because I stood my ground." Mark's wife, Karen, tried to reason with him. "Maybe it's time to take responsibility, Mark," she said gently. "You made a mistake." "Mistake?" Mark interrupted, his voice rising. "This isn't about a mistake, Karen. It's about them wanting to make an example out of me." Karen sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing. Mark had always been stubborn, but this was different. His inability to see beyond his own perspective was what had led him down this path in the first place. Jonathan, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure from all sides. The police union accused him of throwing one of their own under the bus, while community leaders demanded even more sweeping changes. It was a delicate balancing act, and Jonathan knew one misstep could undermine everything he was trying to accomplish. He called a meeting with his command staff, determined to address the issues head-on. The room was filled with tense faces as Jonathan began to speak. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice firm. "What happened at the café is unacceptable, and it's not an isolated incident. We have a problem in this department, and it's my job to fix it. If you're not on board with that, this is your chance to walk away." The room was silent. Jonathan's words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, some of the officers began to see the gravity of the situation. Change was no longer a distant concept. It was happening now, whether they liked it or not. The protests in Willow Creek grew larger with each passing day, drawing activists and supporters from neighboring towns. Linda, though still in recovery, attended one of the rallies, her presence met with cheers and applause. She spoke briefly, her voice amplified by a megaphone. "I'm not here to vilify anyone," she said. "I'm here to demand accountability. We all have a responsibility to make our community better, and that starts with speaking out against injustice." Her words ignited the crowd, and chants of "justice for all" echoed through the streets. Mark, watching the protests from his living room window, felt his resentment deepen. He had always seen himself as a protector of the town, and now he was being painted as a villain. Desperation began to take hold, and he contacted a lawyer to fight the charges against him. But the evidence was damning. Surveillance footage from the café clearly showed Mark throwing the coffee, and testimonies from patrons painted a vivid picture of his unprovoked aggression. The case against him was airtight, and his lawyer advised him to consider a plea deal. Mark refused. "I'm not pleading guilty to something that's been blown out of proportion," he said stubbornly. The trial became a media spectacle, with reporters covering every detail. Linda, though reluctant to relive the trauma, testified against Mark, her voice unwavering as she recounted the events of that fateful day. "I didn't stand up to be a hero," she said on the witness stand. "I stood up because it was the right thing to do. And no one, no matter their position, should be allowed to use their power to silence others." Mark, sitting at the defendant's table, felt a pang of regret for the first time. But his pride wouldn't allow him to show it. As the trial continued, Jonathan focused on the broader picture. He implemented new policies within the department, including body cameras for all officers and an anonymous reporting system for misconduct. He also worked closely with community leaders to rebuild trust, holding town hall meetings to address concerns and listen to feedback. Change was slow, but it was happening. Officers who had previously turned a blind eye began to speak out against their peers, and residents who had once feared the police started to feel hopeful. For Jonathan, the journey was far from over. The trial, the protests, and the internal reforms were just the beginning. But for the first time, he saw a glimmer of the future he had always envisioned, a future where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. And for Mark Thompson, the end of the trial would bring a reckoning he never expected. The court of public opinion. The trial of Mark Thompson was more than just a legal battle. It was a litmus test for Willow Creek's collective conscience. The courtroom, packed with journalists, activists, and concerned residents, became a stage where the town's deepest wounds were laid bare. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, every word uttered by lawyers or witnesses carried weight far beyond the case itself. Linda Carrington sat quietly in the courtroom, her presence a symbol of resilience. The bandages on her face had been removed, but faint scars remained, a physical reminder of the pain she endured. Yet it was her quiet strength that caught the attention of those around her. Despite the trauma, she exuded a grace that inspired others to confront their own fears and biases. Jonathan Carrington, seated a few rows behind his mother, watched the proceedings with a mix of anger and determination. As the town's chief of police, he had to remain impartial, but as Linda's son, he could barely contain his emotions. The case wasn't just about Mark Thompson's actions. It was about exposing a culture that had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. The prosecutor began by presenting the evidence against Mark. Surveillance footage from the café was played for the jury, showing the moment he hurled the scalding coffee at Linda. Gasps filled the courtroom as the scene unfolded on the screen. The prosecutor's voice was steady as she addressed the jury. "This is not just an assault. This is a manifestation of power unchecked, of prejudice allowed to fester within an institution meant to serve and protect." Mark's defense attorney attempted to paint a different picture. He argued that Mark had been under immense stress, that his outburst was a momentary lapse in judgment rather than a reflection of his character. "Officer Thompson has served this community for over a decade," the attorney said, his tone measured. "He made a mistake, but that does not define the entirety of his career." But the prosecution countered with a litany of past complaints against Mark, detailing instances of racial profiling, excessive force, and unprofessional behavior. Witnesses from the community took the stand, recounting stories of harassment and intimidation that painted a damning portrait of a man who had abused his authority for years. One witness, a young black man named Andrew, testified about an incident where Mark had pulled him over without cause. "I was on my way to work," Andrew said, his voice trembling. "Officer Thompson told me my taillight was out, but it wasn't. He made me step out of the car, searched me, and then let me go without explanation. I didn't report it because I didn't think anyone would believe me." As the trial unfolded, tensions in Willow Creek reached a boiling point. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse every day, their chants echoing through the town square. Signs reading "Justice for Linda" and "End Police Bias" were held high, while counter-protesters, arguing that Mark was being unfairly vilified, formed their own contingent. The media painted a stark picture of a town divided, but within the courthouse, a different narrative began to emerge. The testimonies of marginalized residents revealed a shared pain, a collective yearning for change that transcended race and class. For many, Linda's courage had become a rallying cry, a reminder that standing up to injustice was not just necessary but possible. Mark Thompson sat stone-faced throughout the trial, his once confident demeanor replaced with a quiet defensiveness. He avoided looking at Linda, his guilt and shame buried beneath layers of stubborn pride. His wife, Karen, attended the proceedings daily, her face a mask of worry. She had tried to convince Mark to apologize, to show remorse, but he refused. "They're out to destroy me," Mark told her one night, his voice bitter. "Admitting guilt won't change anything." Karen sighed, her patience wearing thin. "It's not about changing what happened, Mark. It's about taking responsibility." But responsibility was a concept Mark struggled to grasp. For years, he had operated with impunity, believing that his badge shielded him from accountability. Now, as the walls closed in, he found himself unable to confront the consequences of his actions. Linda took the stand on the third day of the trial. The courtroom fell silent as she recounted the events of that fateful day. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of her pain. "I didn't know who Mark Thompson was when I spoke up," she said. "I didn't see a police officer or a man of authority. I saw someone using anger to silence others, and I couldn't stay quiet. What happened to me wasn't just an attack on my body. It was an attack on my voice, on my right to be heard." Her testimony was met with nods from the jury and murmurs of agreement from the audience. Even Mark's defense attorney seemed momentarily shaken by her words. Outside the courthouse, the protests grew larger and more diverse. What began as a local movement had attracted national attention, drawing activists, politicians, and community leaders to Willow Creek. Among them was Reverend Elijah Carter, a prominent civil rights leader who delivered an impassioned speech to the crowd. "This trial is not just about one man's actions," Reverend Carter said, his voice booming through a megaphone. "It's about a system that has failed us for too long. But we will not be silent. We will not be ignored. Change is coming, and it starts here, in Willow Creek." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy fueled by his words. For the first time, the town began to feel a sense of unity, a shared determination to confront its flaws and build something better. As the trial neared its conclusion, Mark's defense attorney made a last-ditch effort to humanize his client. "Mark Thompson is a flawed man," the attorney admitted during closing arguments, "but he is not a monster. He is a product of a system that failed to guide him, that allowed him to believe his actions were acceptable. Let us not condemn him entirely but recognize the need for systemic change." The prosecutor, however, was unyielding in her response. Officer Thompson's actions were not the result of a flawed system. They were the result of a flawed character. He chose to act with malice, to abuse his power, and to harm an innocent woman. Justice demands accountability, and accountability begins here. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the case evident in their somber expressions. When they finally returned with a verdict, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty on all charges. The room erupted, some in cheers, others in silence, and a few in tears. Mark's face remained impassive, but his wife wept openly, her hope for leniency shattered. For Linda and Jonathan, the verdict was a step toward healing, but not the end of their journey. The real work, transforming Willow Creek into a place where justice was truly blind, was just beginning. As the courthouse emptied, Linda stood outside with Jonathan, the autumn breeze carrying the sounds of celebration and reflection. She looked up at her son, her pride in him shining brighter than the scars on her face. "You've done so much already," she said, "but there's still more to do." Jonathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the crowd. "We'll do it together, Mom. This is just the beginning." And for the first time in decades, Willow Creek felt like a town on the brink of true change, a place where hope was no longer a distant dream but a tangible reality. Rebuilding bridges, redefining justice. Mark Thompson's conviction sent ripples through Willow Creek, shaking the town to its core. The verdict was celebrated by many as a victory for justice, but it also left behind a wake of unresolved emotions. For some, the trial marked the beginning of healing. For others, it unearthed a deep resentment that threatened to divide the town even further. In the aftermath, Jonathan Carrington knew the real challenge lay ahead: restoring trust and building a bridge between the police department and the community. Jonathan's first step was to face his officers directly. The atmosphere in the police precinct was tense, with many officers feeling betrayed by the trial and conviction of one of their own. Jonathan understood their frustration but was unwavering in his resolve. During a mandatory meeting, he stood before his staff, his voice calm but firm. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult for all of us. What happened was painful, but it was necessary. This department has to be better. We're here to serve the community, not to rule over it. If we're going to move forward, we have to confront the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is." One officer, Sergeant Riley, raised his hand. "With all due respect, Chief, it feels like we're being painted as the bad guys. How can we rebuild trust when the community sees us as the enemy?" Jonathan met his gaze. "Trust is earned, not given. We have to prove, through our actions, that we're committed to justice for everyone. That starts with accountability, something that's been missing for too long." The room was silent, the weight of Jonathan's words sinking in. For the first time, many officers began to see the larger picture. It wasn't about individual blame. It was about systemic change. Meanwhile, Linda Carrington found herself at the center of a growing movement. Her story had inspired others to share their own experiences, and she quickly became a sought-after speaker at town halls and community events. Though she had never envisioned herself in such a role, Linda embraced the opportunity to effect change. At one town hall, she addressed a packed room of residents, her voice steady despite the emotion in her words. "What happened to me was a symptom of a larger problem. But I refuse to let it define me, and I refuse to let it divide us. We can't move forward by pointing fingers. We have to work together to create a community we're all proud to call home." Her words were met with applause, and afterward, a line of people formed to speak with her. Among them was a young woman named Maria, who shared her own story of being harassed by an officer. "Your courage gives me hope," Maria said, tears in her eyes. "I've been too scared to speak up, but seeing you fight for justice makes me believe things can change." Linda placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. "Your voice matters. Don't ever forget that." Despite the progress, not everyone was on board with the changes sweeping through Willow Creek. A vocal minority of residents, many of them loyal supporters of Mark Thompson, viewed his conviction as a betrayal. They gathered in small groups, grumbling about overreach and political correctness. Mark's wife, Karen, became a reluctant figurehead for this group. Though she had privately struggled with her husband's actions, she couldn't bring herself to abandon him. At a small gathering, she addressed the crowd, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Mark made a mistake, but he's not the monster they've made him out to be," she said. "This trial wasn't just about him. It was about tearing down everything we've built in this town." Her words resonated with those who felt left behind by the changes. They saw themselves as victims of a shifting culture, clinging to a past that no longer fit the reality of Willow Creek. Jonathan knew he couldn't ignore these dissenting voices. He organized a series of community forums, inviting residents from all sides to share their perspectives. The first forum was contentious, with heated arguments erupting between those demanding justice and those defending the status quo. "Why should we trust you?" one man shouted, his face red with anger. "You threw one of your own under the bus. How do we know you won't do it again?" Jonathan remained calm, his voice steady as he responded. "Because accountability isn't betrayal. It's the foundation of trust. We can't ask the community to trust us if we don't hold ourselves to the same standard." The man scoffed but said nothing further. Slowly, the room began to shift. Residents who had once been at odds found common ground in their shared desire for safety and fairness. Meanwhile, the police department began implementing Jonathan's reforms. Mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques became a staple, and officers were required to participate in community outreach programs. At first, the changes were met with resistance, but over time, many officers began to see the value in building relationships with the people they served. One such officer was Detective Monica Hughes, who had been skeptical of Jonathan's leadership. But after attending a community picnic organized by the department, she found herself sitting with a group of teenagers, laughing and sharing stories. "I never realized how much we're seen as the enemy," Monica admitted to Jonathan later. "It's eye-opening and humbling." "That's the first step," Jonathan replied. "Understanding the problem is the only way we can solve it." As the weeks turned into months, Willow Creek began to feel a shift. The protests gave way to dialogue, and the divisions within the community started to mend. Linda continued her advocacy, working closely with Jonathan to push for broader reforms at the state level. But for Mark Thompson, the consequences of his actions were just beginning. His conviction had stripped him of his badge, and he found himself ostracized by many of the people who had once supported him. Job opportunities were scarce, and his reputation was in shambles. Sitting alone in his modest home, Mark finally began to reflect on the choices that had led him to this point. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions, not as a victim, but as a perpetrator. Linda's resilience became a beacon of hope for others, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to light. Jonathan's unwavering commitment to justice earned him the respect of many, though he knew the journey was far from over. The town of Willow Creek, once divided by prejudice and fear, had begun to find its way toward unity. The scars of the past remained, but they served as a reminder of the strength it took to confront injustice and rebuild a better future. And as Linda watched the sun set over her garden, she felt a quiet sense of peace. Her scars, both physical and emotional, told a story of pain, resilience, and the power of change. A town transformed. Months after Mark Thompson's conviction, Willow Creek stood at a crossroads, its identity slowly reshaping. The town was no longer a place of quiet complacency, but a community grappling with its past and striving for a better future. This transformation, however, was neither smooth nor free of conflict. The road to justice and reconciliation was marked by tension, resistance, and the ever-present question of whether true change was even possible. Jonathan Carrington sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports from his department. The reforms he had implemented were beginning to show results. Complaints of police misconduct had dropped, and officers reported feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Yet for every step forward, there were setbacks. Some officers resisted the changes, seeing them as an attack on their integrity, while others quietly left the force altogether. One of Jonathan's most vocal critics within the department was Lieutenant Greg Harper, a veteran officer who had served alongside Mark Thompson for years. Harper made no secret of his disdain for Jonathan's leadership, often grumbling about the softening of the department. During a staff meeting, Harper finally voiced his frustrations openly. "With all due respect, Chief," he began, his tone laced with sarcasm, "it feels like we're spending more time in training sessions and community events than actually doing our jobs. We're cops, not social workers." Jonathan met his gaze without flinching. "Our job is to serve and protect the community, Lieutenant. If building trust and understanding with the people we serve feels like a waste of time to you, then perhaps you need to rethink why you're wearing that badge." The room fell silent, tension hanging thick in the air. Harper clenched his jaw but said nothing further. Jonathan knew he couldn't force everyone to embrace the changes, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Outside the department, the town itself was undergoing its own transformation. Community groups that had formed in the wake of Linda's assault continued to grow, their efforts focused on creating spaces for dialogue and collaboration. One such group, called Willow Together, organized events ranging from town hall meetings to cleanup projects in neglected neighborhoods. Linda Carrington became an honorary member, her quiet leadership inspiring others to take action. At one Willow Together event, Linda found herself speaking with a young woman named Aisha, who had recently moved to Willow Creek with her family. "This town feels different," Aisha said, her voice tinged with hope. "I've lived in places where people pretend to care, but here, it feels real. Like people are actually trying to make things better." Linda smiled. "It's not perfect, but progress rarely is. What matters is that we don't stop trying." Despite these strides, there were still those in Willow Creek who clung to the old ways. Small but vocal groups, including those loyal to Mark Thompson, continued to push back against the changes, framing them as an attack on tradition. At one town council meeting, a man named Bill Peters, a longtime resident, voiced his concerns. "All this talk of reform is tearing our town apart," Bill said, his voice rising. "We were fine before all this. Now it's protests, cameras on cops, and people afraid to do their jobs." Linda, seated in the audience, stood and addressed Bill directly. "We weren't fine, Bill," she said calmly. "We just didn't see the problems, or chose not to. Change is hard, but it's necessary. If we ignore what's broken, we're no better than the ones breaking it." Her words resonated with many in the room, though not everyone was convinced. Change, as always, came slowly. Mark Thompson, meanwhile, was living in a self-imposed exile. His conviction had cost him his badge, his reputation, and many of his friends. The man who once commanded authority in Willow Creek was now a pariah, avoided even by those who had once admired him. He spent his days aimlessly, replaying the events of the trial in his mind, and wrestling with a growing sense of regret. One evening, Karen confronted him in their small living room. "Mark, this isn't working. You can't just sit here and wallow. You need to do something, anything, to make this right." Mark looked at her, his eyes heavy with guilt. "What do you want me to do, Karen? Go out there and tell everyone I'm sorry. It won't change what happened." "No, it won't," Karen replied. "But it might change you." Her words struck a chord. For the first time, Mark began to consider the possibility of redemption, not for the town's sake, but for his own. Jonathan, too, was grappling with the complexities of change. While progress was being made, the weight of leadership took its toll. Late one evening, as he reviewed reports in his office, Linda stopped by with a thermos of coffee. "You've been working too hard," she said, placing the thermos on his desk. Jonathan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Comes with the territory, Mom." Linda sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "You've done so much already, Jonathan. But remember, it's not all on you. Change takes a village." "I know," Jonathan replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I just want to make sure I don't let anyone down." Linda reached across the desk and took his hand. "You're not letting anyone down. You're leading by example, and that's more than enough." As the months passed, the impact of Jonathan's leadership and Linda's advocacy began to ripple outward. Other towns in the region looked to Willow Creek as a model for reform, inviting Jonathan and Linda to speak at conferences and workshops. Their story became a beacon of hope, proof that even the most entrenched systems could change with courage and persistence. But Willow Creek's transformation wasn't without its scars. The town bore the weight of its history, the memory of its divisions serving as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of its resilience. For Linda, the journey was deeply personal. As she tended to her garden one sunny afternoon, she reflected on how far she and the town had come. The scars on her face had faded, but they would never disappear entirely. And that was okay. They were a part of her story, a testament to her strength. Mark, meanwhile, took the first tentative steps toward redemption. He began volunteering at a local community center, working with at-risk youth and sharing his story as a cautionary tale. Though some remained skeptical of his intentions, others saw his efforts as a sign of genuine remorse. In the end, Willow Creek became a town transformed. Not perfect, but better. The changes that had begun with one moment of violence had grown into something larger, something lasting. And as the sun set over the town square, its streets filled with laughter and conversation, Linda Carrington and Jonathan Carrington knew that their work was far from over. But for the first time, they believed in the possibility of a brighter future, a legacy of hope. Willow Creek had come a long way since the fateful day at the Willow Bean Café, but the journey was far from over. While progress was evident in the transformed police department, the strengthened community ties, and the heightened sense of accountability, challenges persisted. For Jonathan Carrington and Linda Carrington, the work was not just about healing a town, but creating a legacy that would outlast them. A legacy of hope, justice, and unyielding resolve. Jonathan walked into a packed auditorium at Willow Creek High School, where he had been invited to speak at a community event celebrating the town's progress. The room was buzzing with anticipation, filled with people of all ages and backgrounds. Students, parents, teachers, and community leaders had gathered to hear the chief of police share his vision for the future. Taking the stage, Jonathan scanned the crowd. His mother sat in the front row, her presence a quiet reminder of the strength that had brought them to this moment. He adjusted the microphone and began. "Good evening," he started, his voice steady and commanding. "When I was first sworn in as chief of police, I knew this job wouldn't be easy. I knew change wouldn't come overnight, but I also knew that this community had the strength and courage to face the hard truths and work toward a better future." He paused, letting his words sink in. What happened to my mother was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. It forced us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what kind of town do we want to be? Do we want to be a place where injustice is ignored, or do we want to be a place where everyone feels safe, valued, and heard? The audience nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the room. Today, we're not just talking about change. We're living it. Our police department has implemented reforms that make us more accountable, transparent, and connected to the community. But let me be clear, this is just the beginning. Real change takes time, and it takes all of us. The crowd erupted into applause, their enthusiasm a testament to the progress they had made together. Meanwhile, Linda had found her own way to contribute to the town's healing. She had started a grassroots organization called Voices for Justice, dedicated to providing support for victims of police misconduct and advocating for systemic reform. The group quickly gained traction, drawing members from all walks of life. One of Linda's proudest achievements was the establishment of a scholarship program for students pursuing careers in criminal justice, social work, or public service. The scholarship, named the Willow Creek Justice Fund, aimed to empower the next generation of leaders to continue the fight for equity and fairness. At a ceremony announcing the first recipients, Linda spoke with the same quiet conviction that had inspired so many. "When I was a teacher, I believed in the power of education to change lives," she said. "Now I believe in the power of young people to change the world." These scholarships are more than financial support. They're an investment in a future where justice isn't just a dream but a reality. The applause that followed was heartfelt, and Linda felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her scars, both visible and invisible, had become symbols of resilience and hope. Mark Thompson, on the other hand, was navigating his own path toward redemption. Though many in Willow Creek still viewed him with suspicion, his efforts at the community center had begun to bear fruit. Working with at-risk youth had forced Mark to confront the biases and anger that had shaped his actions for so long. One day, while helping a group of teenagers with a leadership project, Mark overheard a boy named Jamal talking about his distrust of the police. "They don't care about us," Jamal said, his voice filled with frustration. "They just see us as trouble." Mark hesitated, then stepped into the conversation. "I used to be one of those officers," he admitted. "I let my anger and prejudice cloud my judgment, and I hurt people because of it. But I'm here now because I want to make things right, and I want to help you believe that change is possible." Jamal looked at Mark skeptically but nodded. "We'll see," he said, his tone cautious but not dismissive. For Mark, it was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about taking responsibility for it and striving to do better. As the seasons changed, so did Willow Creek. The town's annual harvest festival, once a simple celebration of autumn, had been reimagined as a showcase of unity and progress. This year's festival featured booths from community organizations, performances by local artists, and speeches from leaders like Jonathan and Linda. Jonathan stood with his mother, watching as families and friends mingled under the golden glow of string lights. Children laughed as they played games, while adults engaged in lively conversations about the town's future. "This feels different," Linda said, a smile playing on her lips. "It feels hopeful." Jonathan nodded, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "It is, Mom, and it's because of people like you." Linda shook her head. "No, Jonathan. It's because of all of us. It's because we refuse to give up." That evening, as the festival wound down, Linda took a moment to reflect. She thought about how far they had come. From the day she walked into the Willow Bean Café to this moment of unity and celebration. The scars on her face, once a painful reminder of her trauma, had become symbols of her strength and resilience. Sitting beside her in the glow of a fire pit, Jonathan broke the silence. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been if that day never happened?" Linda nodded slowly. "I do. But I also think about how much we've gained because of it. Sometimes it takes something painful to spark real change." Jonathan smiled, his admiration for his mother evident. "You're incredible, you know that." Linda laughed softly. "I'm just a stubborn old woman who believes in doing what's right." "No," Jonathan said firmly. "You're a force of nature." As the stars filled the night sky over Willow Creek, the town stood as a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and community. The road to justice and reconciliation was far from over, but the people of Willow Creek had proven that even the deepest wounds could heal when met with determination and hope. And for Linda and Jonathan Carrington, their journey was a reminder that one voice, one act of courage, could indeed change the course of a community, creating a legacy that would endure for generations to come. A legacy cemented. The festival's final moments lingered in Linda's memory long after the music faded and the last lights dimmed. It wasn't just an event. It was a milestone, a visible symbol of how far Willow Creek had come. Yet, Linda knew that change, while inspiring, was fragile. It required vigilance, persistence, and an unyielding commitment to the values they had fought so hard to instill. The next morning, Linda met Jonathan for breakfast at their favorite diner. The place was buzzing with post-festival energy, the air filled with chatter about the night's highlights. Jonathan had brought along a folder of documents, his mind already back to work. "You know," Linda said, sipping her coffee, "you could take a day off. The town will survive without you for 24 hours. Jonathan chuckled. "I'll consider it, but there's something I wanted to talk to you about." He slid the folder across the table. Inside was a draft proposal for a statewide initiative to implement reforms similar to those in Willow Creek. The initiative, called the Carrington Plan, would focus on accountability, community engagement, and bias training across law enforcement agencies. "They want me to present this to the governor next month," Jonathan said. "But I was thinking, maybe we should present it together. This is as much your work as it is mine." Linda's eyes widened. "Jonathan, I'm just a retired school teacher. What do I know about statewide reform?" "You know more than most," Jonathan replied. "You've lived it. Your voice has inspired this town. Imagine what it could do for the entire state." Linda hesitated, the weight of the proposal sinking in. But as she looked at her son, she saw the same determination that had driven him to take on the toughest job in Willow Creek. How could she say no? "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do it." The weeks leading up to the presentation were a whirlwind of preparation. Jonathan and Linda traveled to neighboring towns, meeting with community leaders, activists, and law enforcement officials. They shared Willow Creek's story, the mistakes, the pain, the progress, and invited others to join their vision for a fairer, more equitable future. Not everyone was receptive. At one town hall in a more conservative community, Jonathan faced sharp criticism from a police chief who felt the reforms undermined his officer's authority. "With all due respect, Chief Carrington," the man said, his tone icy, "you're turning law enforcement into a PR campaign. Real policing doesn't happen in town halls and bake sales." Jonathan remained calm. Real policing happens when communities trust their officers. Without that trust, we're just enforcers, not protectors. If that feels like PR to you, maybe it's time to reconsider your priorities. The room erupted in applause, and the police chief sank back into his seat, visibly chastened. On the day of the presentation to the governor, Linda felt a mix of nerves and excitement. She and Jonathan stood together at the podium, facing a room filled with lawmakers, activists, and media. Jonathan opened with a powerful statement about the importance of accountability and community trust, then handed the microphone to his mother. Linda took a deep breath, her hand steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Linda Carrington, and I'm here today not as a policymaker or a public figure, but as a mother, a teacher, and a survivor. My story isn't unique. It's the story of countless others who have faced injustice and wondered if their voices would ever be heard." She paused, letting her words settle over the audience. "What happened to me could have broken me, but it didn't. Instead, it gave me purpose, and it showed me that change is possible, even in the face of fear and resistance. The reforms we've implemented in Willow Creek didn't just transform a police department. They transformed a community. And if we can do it, so can the rest of this state." By the time Linda finished, the room was silent, captivated by her authenticity and conviction. Then, one by one, people began to rise, their applause building into a standing ovation. The Carrington Plan passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, setting a new standard for law enforcement reform across the state. It was a victory not just for Jonathan and Linda, but for everyone who had fought for justice in Willow Creek and beyond. Back in Willow Creek, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer a source of pain. They were a testament to resilience. Linda continued her work with Voices for Justice, mentoring young activists and ensuring that the town never lost sight of its progress. Jonathan, too, found new ways to lead. He launched a mentorship program for young officers, pairing them with community leaders to build empathy and understanding. The program quickly became a model for other departments, further cementing Willow Creek's reputation as a leader in reform. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Linda sat on her porch, a cup of tea in hand. The air was warm, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from the town square. Jonathan joined her, settling into the chair beside her. "You've done good, Mom," he said, his voice filled with pride. "We've done good." Linda smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not over, Jonathan. There's always more to do." "I know," he replied. "But tonight, let's just enjoy this." And for a moment, they did. Under the fading light of the day, mother and son sat together, their hearts full of hope and their eyes fixed on the future, a future they had fought to make brighter for everyone. In that quiet moment, Willow Creek stood as a testament to what could be achieved when courage met compassion, and when a single voice refused to be silenced.